Well, folks, after that wonderful musical introduction, who better to have on this episode of the Join the Dots podcast than the one and only Mark Martin, or the Urban Teacher. Mark, lovely to see you. Thank you for joining our podcast. Matt and I have been looking at lots of different perspectives we want to try and bring together. And obviously, you're looking very youthful, but you've been around a while. You've been involved in all sorts of things in the education, EdTech space. We're all recovering from an overdose of EdTech last week or the week before at BET. And it's a constant conversation now, particularly with the rise of AI and some very noisy people around the world telling us how we should be thinking. So first and foremost, for those listening, just a brief introduction, if you wouldn't mind, about your good self. And then what do you see as the burning topics right now that we should be talking about?
So, thank you for having me, Al and Matt, and really excited to be on the show. So my name is Mark Martin. I'm Assistant Professor in Computer Science and Education Practice. Been teaching in education for the last 20 years now. So I started in 2004. This marks, 21, coming up 21 years now. And during that time, I started off teaching ICT, the EdXL days of GMVQs and OCRs and a range of different kind of curriculums. Done a lot of curriculum development in Key Stage 3. So I designed my own computer curriculum and done a lot of work around GCSE and A levels. Then obviously when Mike Gove changed the curriculum from ICT to computer science, that was a massive kind of shift in terms of my practice and performance in the sense of teaching, programming, software development, and so forth. Now, probably in that span of my career, I've had a big passion around how do we use technology to enhance teaching and learning within the classroom. So I've been able to work with a lot of the big brands to kind of figure out how do we help young people to get to that next level of their learning. What are the things that technology can do? And what are things that technology are doing to disrupt education? So I think we're at this junction now where, they say history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And what we find probably every decade, there is a new kind of innovation that's going to take over teachers and is going to replace us in terms of what we do in the classroom. But ultimately, as we're facing that, AI is the big buzzword. And one of the things that I like to share with people before we go deeper into it is about what is this tool? What's the pedagogy to this tool? How is it going to support the whole ecosystem rather than just the flash pan activities? And that's what I've always been conscious of in the past because, it's not worth just dumping tools into education and just leaving young people and teachers to figure it out. So let me land my plane there and I'm happy to continue the conversation.
We can go off on all sorts of strands there, can't we? I think it's a really interesting one. Wearing a slightly different hat, but as you know, I spend a lot of time working with schools, school districts, international schools, and AI, of course, is a hot topic. There's a bit of a disconnect between the fear of AI and this concept that AI will replace educators, and seeing schools who are recognizing that there is potentially for evidence-informed solutions, which is often the hard thing when it's something brand new. Actually, at the moment, AI is much more of a drive around reducing staff workloads to free up more human-to-human time. And there's more fear, shall we say, around technology when it moves into the teaching and learning space. Because do we have to change the way we assess? Do we have to find different measures of understanding? So where do you sit? I mean, we can't take as was the knee-jerk in the States for a good while, which is we'll just ban the use of AI. Our children will access it. They'll find places. So where do you start your conversation to mitigate the fear?
It's super interesting, right? Because ultimately, one of the things that people don't really talk about is if you removed all technology from education, would the education system be running smooth? And we know that it is got a range of different challenges from teacher workload to ramping up expectations, ramping up grades and so forth. So we know that there's an issue without the technology. Now, what makes it even more complex is when we say actually technology can remove some of the problems that we have created by ourselves. And that's what creates more of the more of the issue around, can AI now reduce the workload? No, the education needs to reformat how it does workload. That's how I would say it. And then how can we use AI to streamline that? So one of the things that we're seeing a lot of now is that we're trying to use technology to paint over the cracks. And that's the main issue here, in terms of there are massive cracks in education. It can be solved through policy around fairer, how do we, support the workforce? But ultimately, irrespective of the technology, it cannot paint over the cracks. That are how I see it.
I love that. I'm going to hand over to Matt in a second, because I think around the education, the curriculum, what we're trying to deliver, there is a louder and more consistent voice, which is change is not about polishing the edges, but it's about changing what we offer, our provision, being mindful of what employers are looking for, the skills agenda being more dominant, and technology is but one tool in the toolkit. So I think often when we talk about AI, and I've seen it increasingly of late, the actual bit about AI is simply the catalyst to talk about the other challenges: teacher workload, recruitment, retention, the skills agenda, curriculum not being fit for purpose. Is it inclusive enough? The list goes on. But AI's just brought that conversation to the fore, maybe unhelpfully, because some people claim it's the panacea to everything, and perhaps helpfully because it's reminded us that in combination with other reform, maybe there's a better way, because we're not going to magically double our teaching workforce. So there's a kind of a double link there. Matt, this is something I know, Crossfate, you've used technology purposefully, but you certainly don't see it as the be all and end all when there's an opportunity to get out with a llama.
At all, alpaca, Alf.
Yeah, I've got the name wrong, which puts me in the doghouse straight away.
The whole species wrong, never mind the name. No, I don't know. It's I sort of look at social media with distrust or mistrust constantly all the time now, and I think you've just hit the nail on the head there. There's a lot of people saying AI is going to solve our problems, and I've written down Mark's quote: "We can't use technology to paper over crack." Down. And I think the government's trying to do that, like everybody else. And I remember they released the £4 million AI fund back in the autumn. And if you've got any knowledge, you'll know there's £4 million for artificial intelligence to support teachers who don't have devices, who are working in schools without a wireless infrastructure, that have not had CPD. What an absolute nonsense. But Mark won't remember that about 7 or 8 years ago, we met for the first time via Pete Rafferty, as ever. I met everyone via Pete Rafferty. And you were giving a speech. I think it was University of East London. It was somewhere near Betts, I can't remember. But you gave a quote that I've used ever since, or you gave a little talk. And it was talking about McDonald's and how technology impacted McDonald's. And like you used to go in, you used to speak to somebody, and they would turn around and speak to somebody, and there was paper. And then this, like I said, this is 7 years ago. And then it became, you go in and there's a touch screen, and now you do a touch screen, and some of it is automated.
Yes.
And yeah, that sort of stuck with me about a perfect way of how society is changing. Jobs of the future are changing, but education hasn't. But now I look at things that are coming out, and you referenced DeepSeek earlier, and the speed of change isn't so much 10 years or 1 year. It feels like every day there's something new coming out, and education is woefully behind anyway. DeepSeek you referenced, but if you were to give you a McDonald's talk now, would it include robots? Would we have robots as well as AI, telling us what we want? We're in the mood for this. What would your McDonald's talk be now?
It's really interesting you say that, because just to touch on Al's point, I think many moons ago, I think the government invested £78 million with some of the big leading tech companies and organisations to improve the quality of the ICT curriculum. And that was probably about in 2017, I think, if I can recall. And we're none the wiser now. So throwing money at this is not the answer. And then going into over your point, Matt, in the sense that, yes, our ultimate aim is to help young people to understand the world around them. And if it's becoming more digital, then it's our kind of responsibility to make sure that happens. So as I was alluding to, long gone are the days where now you go into McDonald's and just order something at the counter. You've got to go to the touch screen. You've got to tap, swipe, do all of the kind of things to get your order prompt. And similar for a lot of how young people use social media? How do they use technology within their local spaces? And ultimately, us who are in the computer science space delivering this curriculum is to help young people to navigate that space before they're manipulated or they're lost within that system, they become a victim. So for us and for me, I've always seen us leaders as a mighty responsibility. It's not just teaching young people a fancy tool to pass an exam. It's about, what is this tool going to help this young person in life? How is it going to help them in the future? And it's really interesting, not to go too side off the tracks. I used to run a after school club because a lot of the innovation that I wanted to bring into the classroom, it couldn't fit into the Key Stage 3 or Key Stage 4 curriculum. So it was just for me, it was disappointing because all of this kind of machine learning, AI, EdTech, and so forth. And when I brought it in after school, the same kids that came to the after school club have now got jobs in EdTech doing the programming and software development. So I do see that, there is a lot of negativity or positivity, however you want to say it. But for me, I see, can the student get a job in this? One day, how can they see their self within this innovation? And the small efforts that we do to show young people around these tools and technology, it's going to further us all. I think that AI's knocked off Al for a sec, so we'll probably have to give him a sec to reboot.
We'll keep going. It might just be the camera, but I'm just curious. You're in FE. I know you've done different phases of education. I'm fascinated by Estonia, where they start digital education at 3. I get really frustrated with the whole. We start this at Key Stage 4, and you're talking computer science, and what you're doing is great. And if they've got success stories behind it, and that they're now working in technology, do you think primary schools and nurseries should be starting to sort of introduce various things at various points, including misinformation as well as,
Yeah, so it's interesting because I worked in primary schools for at least 4 years. So one head teacher asked me to come in and shadow their head of ICT at a primary school. And at the time, we was doing a lot around Lego. So Lego exploration, where we was getting the Legos to, put in commands and prompts, and then the Lego would do certain actions. I think just like in European countries, what they tend to do with EdTech is spark the curiosity out of the students. So it's not just about do this and understand the algorithm. It's about sparking that curiosity, then introducing how these things work. I think a lot in the education system in the UK is about do this first and then spark the curiosity. We do it back to front over here. But I agree with what you're saying. It should be something that students should be accessible to, because if they're not doing it, they're doing it at home most probably, and doing it in their spare time.
There's an interesting kind of theme here, because a bit like funding for some AI tools to support the current curriculum. There's a bit of a horse and cart going on there, because why are we creating tools to support a curriculum that we want to review and redesign? I love the fact you talked about Estonia, because one of the things that I researched as part of a book that I was writing was recognizing that many of those countries had the seismic shift of leaving the Soviet Union and wanting to completely redesign their curriculum to not reflect Russian history and Russian approach to education, but their own. In essence, they almost had a blank canvas to redesign what would be an appropriate curriculum. And I absolutely support, Mark, your comments about changing the way and the age and stage that we engage the learning process and that curiosity. And it almost reinforces that mindset that says, well, actually, it's the same here. We're tinkering around the edges rather than having that opportunity to actually sit and reflect back. Just moving the topic on, you were talking obviously about, in the broader brush, we could call it digital citizenship, but developing those digital skills that allow our children to progress into the workplace and in life safely and know what they're doing. And recent conversations, DeepSeek's a really good one. Now, there's loads of AI tools out there. Our challenge with them is the efficacy, authenticity of the content they have. So DeepSeek already, we're talking about certain historical events in China being excluded from its large language model training. We've got OpenAI complaining because some of their work and effort they think has been copied. Slightly ironic, given where OpenAI has got most of its data from, which is copying from here, there, and everywhere. So how do you start that conversation in your organization? Does it start with what can we do with our learners? or increasingly what I'm seeing is we're missing the gap about how do we actually empower our staff to feel confident having those conversations and looking at where things are purposeful.
So back in the day, we used to say to students, we don't want them to be consumers. We want them to be the creators of EdTech. So we want them to be the people that are using it as a practical tool. But I will push it one further now and say they should be questioners of the EdTech and of the innovation. So no matter what you're using, students should have a toolkit to ask questions. Parents should have a toolkit to ask questions, teachers and so forth. And the more we ask questions, the more the innovation can actually bloom and grow and then see it as we can use it in society. One major shift for me that's happened in the last probably 8 years is that I used to see EdTech as a tool to enhance teaching and learning. But now more and more, I'm seeing EdTech as a tool to solve the local challenges within local spaces. So a lot of the time now, a lot of my projects are like, how can you use this EdTech to investigate air pollution? Or how can you use this EdTech to look at some of the challenges around knife crime or some of the stuff that young people are struggling with? And what I've seen is by connecting the EdTech to a local-based challenge, it then helps that young person or the school or the community to think, actually, we can see the purpose to this and we can see why I can use it in school or outside of school. So that's my kind of shift in how I use EdTech and think about this space at the moment.
Follow that train of thought, Mark, and I'm sure Matt wants to jump in. I've seen with the advent of more purposeful use of technology, we tend to move to more problem-based learning, which I think ties in very much with your mindset there. And you've talked about air pollution and quality, which is, I remember a few years back, Stephen Heppel doing research and work on air quality in classrooms and the impact on learners. But obviously it goes much wider in terms of the broader community. So it kind of feels like a nice segue because that's something that you've been doing broader research on within your community, isn't it?
Yeah, 100%. So what we've been doing is, it's interesting. I was in a classroom one time and I tried to figure out what's the biggest challenge in my local space. And then I went on the website and saw that the air pollution was one of the highest in Europe where I was situated. So I reached out to about 10 EdTech companies. And it's funny, right? If you're doing anything to promote their brands, they throw tech at you. But when it's something else, then you see the real EdTechs, no names to mention, come through. And the organization that reached out to us was Dyson Foundation. So they gave us 8 sensor kits to empower students to measure their own air pollution in the playground and in the classroom. And one of the research what we wanted to do is how much air pollution is coming from the air vents of the high street into the classroom and again to affect teaching and learning. And what we was able to see is that I thought students would be interested in this thing because it's like, it's far-fetched from what they're doing in school. But for all of a sudden, the students, took it up. They started to ask really scientific, mathematical questions. And that's when I thought, oh my goodness, we're missing a trick with this whole EdTech thing here because now we've got students building their own air sensors. They're bringing in their maths. They're bringing in their science skills. They're bringing in their citizenship skills to art things that relate to them. And then obviously we saw before I end, we saw a correlation between if the air pollution is high within a school, the attendance is low because probably asthma attacks, respiratory illnesses, all of this is triggered when it's very high. It matters to our students, and they did take a note of that when we were doing the research that, sir, a lot of my parents suffer from asthma and all of this. Again, they saw the purpose to why they would use this EdTech to measure and to see some sort of impact. Long gone are the days where students would go to the town hall with a placard. They can now print off their data science skills, their analytics skills, and go to the town hall and say, look, what could we be measuring?
It's a different world to me, Mark. Because what I like about these podcasts is that we came down last week for the Bet Show? Was it the week before? Might have been the week before, can't remember now. But then you posted this week about the air pollution on the different tube lines in London. And our kids had commented on it smells different or it tastes different in these tube lines. But the health implications from what you and your projects and things have done, and I think the closing of some roads in London, the projects there that have shut roads, there's been a significant improvement in health for people, isn't there? Because just looking at the tube lines I was traveling on, one was 4 times what it should be. And I'm thinking, if you're doing that every day, wow, that's got quite an impact long term.
Yeah, 100%. And that's what it is. As I said before, we want to use technology so students have a better understanding of the world. We also want to make sure that the algorithms that students are using, they understand how it operates. And I think that more and more now, for us as educators, is to ensure that students understand to a certain extent how these things are working, because ultimately this could be, and this might be me going over the top, it could be the difference between life and death, in the sense of, if these algorithms are online, we've seen a lot of young people commit suicide because of the way the algorithm is targeted towards them and their image and all of this kind of stuff. And we've seen it in terms of how young people are using it to fuel each other on around gangs and all of this kind of stuff. And we've got to help young people to be able to filter information and filter the algorithm to know when actually this is working against me and I need to turn it off, rather than, continue to believe what the algorithm or the technology is presenting to us. So again, I think more and more now that this whole space that we're in, it cannot just be centered into the classroom. It has to have a holistic approach where everybody's on board with it.
Mark, let's go off on a complete tangent for a second, but I'm interested in your perspective, given your years of experience with educational technology. One of the challenges being discussed at the moment is that we have a wide range of tools coming into our schools that are available, that all come from a fairly narrow set of large language models that are based on capturing information that's out there on the web. And there's a big, big question about how representative that knowledge base is that's being shared. So I was at a conference in Saudi Arabia, and the conversation was 7 or 8% of the world's population are Arabic, but on the internet, only about 3% of the content is in Arabic. Large language models scrape that content, and then you get an artificially low representation of their cultural representations and norms. Women over the last 200 years have invented amazing things, but very few were ever documented in, certainly if we go back to a previous century. Sandy Toksvig is doing the Mapamundi project, trying to signpost and digitize inventions and landmarks in history that were linked to women. When you're talking to your students and they're looking at technology, how do you prepare or bring the conversation to understand that there could be bias, whether it's algorithmically or just on the breadth of the data sets that they also need to take into consideration?
Great question. I think it's one of these things where they used to say garbage in, garbage out. And also we would say that goes for the data, that goes for the algorithm, that goes for the platform, that goes for the developers who make the actual tools and products. And one of the things, I hit a nerve in the EdTech space when I said, I don't want to see the EdTech first. Show me the people on the team. And there was a lot of pushback. I got a bit silenced from that all. And exactly what you're saying is that what would the world look like in the next 50 to 100 years? And that's going to be underpinned by how transparent these data sets and innovation that we're using is. And at the moment, the EdTech has a weird relationship with transparency and showcasing what things actually look like. And that's why I think that, as I said before, we need to empower school leaders now to be able to question this transparency and also the quality of these edtechs that they're using. And I'll put my hat on the ring here. I think 95% of them are not doing that, and they're just buying it based upon the value because it's probably cheaper, it's going to be more efficient, it's going to impact X, Y, and Z, but they're not questioning the authenticity. Now, as a computer scientist, I deliver a few modules around how accurate these systems are. What AI is doing is just reflecting the people that are building these tools, to be honest with you, and reflecting the history books. And if it's a westernized glance of that history book, that's what you're going to get back. So in the health space, when doctors, especially African-American doctors, typed in particular illnesses related to them, it came back with these old tropes from history books that are no longer used in medical terms, but it's still propping up in there. So where did that get that from? Where did it derive that information from. And again, that could be the life or death of an individual. So if you go on AI and ask for some sort of advice or help and it's giving you the old trope, then, that's a major concern.
It's a funny thing, isn't it? We're almost already kind of being really mindful that a lot of people take the output as gospel. It wasn't that long ago that they were doing the analytics and reviews of output from OpenAI in the US and being somewhat surprised that if you search for an image of a doctor, 90% of the people there were white men. And if you asked for a picture of a nurse, they were all female. And yet there's 40% of doctors in America are women. And it was the same with teachers, and it's that kind of mindset of things will refine. But if, as they are doing now, the training data is now being created to create more training data, you in effect amplify any bias that sits there in that information. I do want to support, just on that point before I let you jump in, transparency. Evidence-informed EdTech has been something that I think certainly the last 5 years has become more prevalent. I absolutely agree with you. There needs to be more transparency because there are too many cloud-based vendors that don't have the transparency on that umbilical cord of where does that data go, how's it used, how is it, in some cases, sadly, monetized, but also how does it influence what information you share to the individual. And the more transparent you are, the more likely you are to build a relationship rather than a transaction with a school if you're selling a product.
No, I totally agree. And I was just going to add there that, one of the biggest problems in EdTech is having difficult conversations. And when is it that big tech is going to have those difficult conversations around, how, with these tech platforms? Because what we've seen is that some massive EdTechs will leave their product in the ecosystem for long, and it stifles innovation. So say if you're a startup or a SME trying to get into the EdTech space and showing transparency, you can't survive on a freemium model like big tech, because big tech can burn £1 billion of freemium tools, but you can't do that if you're trying to grow and expand and put bread on the table. So there is an issue at the moment in terms of how do we allow some of these great EdTechs that are doing the work, doing the efficacy, doing a range of different insights and listening to teachers to get into the space rather than them being marginalized because they can't keep up with the big tech.
Oh, Mark, I'm conscious I'm slightly hogging this from Matt, but it's an area that I'm really passionate about because I've seen in recent discussions, we've had government views on technology, digital standards, and the room is filled and always has Microsoft, Google, Amazon Web Services in the room. And I consistently say you've got the fox guarding the chickens. Actually, the best ecosystem, the best innovation in the EdTech space, typically, not exclusively, but there are many educator-led startups that are learning from efficacy, they're co-produced products. And one of the challenges is, much like just taking a lump of money and creating Oak and then saying go away and build an AI tool without any real efficacy behind it, is that not only are you enhancing one voice, but you are proactively diminishing the voice from those that actually have skin in the game in terms of not just we provide products that includes education, but are explicitly education technologists. And I think that yin and the yang, Matt, is something that we've shared and discussed a few times about that dynamic and relationship. And I know you have your criticisms and critiques as well.
Definitely. I'm just go back to what Mark said about a lot of schools are looking for value in terms of EdTech. And I think actually there's a flip side of that coin in that a lot of schools will see the companies with a big marketing budget and sign up for something that isn't necessarily the best product for them. It's often a very expensive product and is actually, it's not fit for purpose what they need to do. Evidence-informed EdTech interests me because I'm desperate to get pupil voice on evidence-informed EdTech. So we take the kids to bed and say, look, what's great? Go and look at the little ones in the startup area. But if a company has to pay to be on a platform, that's not fully representative and fair, I don't think, I'm afraid. And we all know that if they've got reviews on there, that some can be from their own employees. So whereas it's probably quite a reliable indicator, it is just that, an indicator. And what strikes me about schools and EdTech at the moment is that actually you don't need to pay much money for anything that's out there. Google, as a platform is free, Quizzes is free, Canva is free. Yeah, that's all you need.
You just mentioned something really interesting, the deep seek. We might have a deep seek moment in education where, these big the whole story, not just thinking about I just want to think about the innovation in the sense that these big companies are £1 billion spinning it over, but this one has done it in a very efficient way and cut all of that spend to about £6 million. So £6 billion, £6 million, massive. And I'm waiting to see this deep seek moment in education where we remove a lot of these £1 billion entities and we can do it on a much efficient model. And this might even be controversial now. The revolution might not be done online. It might be done offline. So the best EdTech that wins is low tech, it's offline, it's affordable, and it's accessible, and it does what it says on the tin. So I think that that's going to be the way forward. I don't think everything putting on the cloud, AI, all of this fancy buzzwords is going to be the way forward. I think it's going to be much more simplified than that.
Open source.
It's an interesting one, and Mark, I'm with you. Anyone who knows me will know I wear different hats, including being in the EdTech space. We develop cloud-based solutions for schools, but I have continued to keep desktop non-cloud-based solutions because whilst there is huge benefits in some regards, the migration from desktop to cloud was something that Microsoft and Amazon and Google were keen to do because they are hugely more revenue generating for them than the previous model. And I always maintain one size does not fit all. You absolutely can have some tools where there's real logic and value in that. And there are others where actually light touch, low infrastructure is the most important thing. So, I think we're all learning to be a bit smarter and a bit more challenging. And probably the most important thing, whether it's technology, whether it's education, whether it's skills, whether it's the curriculum, is we need to be comfortable and confident to challenge and ask more questions. And sometimes less is more.
100%.
I think we've arrived just past the half-hour mark for our summary there. So before I wrap up with another cheesy jingle on the back end of our little conversation, Mark, anybody listening who's very much themselves looking at the technology space right now and thinking, my goodness, I've only got a blink and the world is changing, what would be your top tips for people to think about right now?
Yes, I think one of the things is I would always say as educators, have a grasp of what's happening in the classroom, what's happening in your school, what's happening in the local space, and what's happening around the world. You need to have different lenses now. You cannot just be facing into the classroom, into a fishbowl. You need to see what's happening in the ocean. And that's what, people ask, Mark, what's been your success over the last 2 decades? It's by having that global and local view of my profession and then helping me to navigate in terms of what things I want to embrace and what things I don't want to embrace, or what's the general consensus. Does it work in this school, in a multi-academy trust, but does it work in a local foundation school? So the more you're able to have different perspectives of your practice and your profession, I would say that's one of the best CPDs or tips I can give to a professional within this space.
Any closing thoughts, Matt?
No, I'm scribbling a lot of things down, to be honest. It's
I'm looking forward to the notes afterwards as well, remembering it all.
I've written several post-its of notes from Mark, and I feel like I should be interviewed. I'm just listening instead.
It's really interesting. Mark and I are doing a number of podcast recordings today on very different topics. And there's a shift in our interests of what things we pick up on and like. And I think as are the best podcasts that I listen to, and hopefully many will eventually be listening to as well. Sometimes you need to listen to them a couple of times and you pick up different things that just trigger an interest and so on.
Can I ask one last thing, Al? Sorry.
Yeah, go for it.
Mark, we've just been on with Dave McPartland, who you may not know. I don't know. He's a head that took his kids on Britain's Got Talent and does some brilliant stuff. And Al came up with the idea of a community premium for schools, in that schools get a premium to actually build a community, like almost a Sure Start aspect to it. That would work great for rural areas and towns. Would it work well in London as well, do you think? Is that an idea to sort of pursue or to develop more? Well,
unless you're willing to get around the multi-academy trust gridlock. So they would claim that they do it already in terms of having some of them have 50 schools in their clusters and so forth. But again, there's no harm in terms of, especially in inner cities, how do we kind of create more of a community structure? And I think, so just to wrap up, I think there is something to be said around rural schools. And I know we haven't spoken about it a lot on this show here, but I think they're going to be the game changers to the whole education system, because where they don't have the connectivity, they're making their own innovation. They say where there's necessity, there's innovation breeds. And I think I'm seeing it a lot more in the schools that are not part of the, quote unquote grid, that are innovating, that are creating these kind of communities and project-based learning and doing a range of different things. And I think that, how do rural schools champion that? How do they celebrate that rather than see it as a negative, in the sense that they are isolated from a lot of the big talks, but they're doing amazing stuff in their own regions across the UK?
I'm going to second that, because I've got Matt sat there and we're just back with Dave Bartland, and they're two great examples of folks, different settings, but absolutely having to fly the flag and lead without necessarily all that external support that you might see. Mark, thank you so much for your time this morning.
Yes,
really appreciate you joining our conversation. I think it's time for some outro funk.